The scissors lay scattered in the dirt like broken bones, glinting in the harsh afternoon sun. Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell knelt in the dust outside Murphy's saloon, her once long auburn hair now lying in jagged clumps around her trembling shoulders. What remained hung in uneven patches, some strands barely reaching her jawline, others hacked nearly to her scalp. "That's what happens when city folk think they can lecture us about proper Christian living," sneered Jake Morrison, wiping his hands on his vest as if he'd just finished shoeing a horse. The other men chuckled, their faces flushed with whiskey and cruelty. Sarah's fingers found the ragged ends of what used to cascade to her waist, hair her grandmother had taught her to braid with lavender ribbons every Sunday morning. Now it felt like touching broken glass. She didn't cry, couldn't. The shock had frozen something deep inside her chest. From across the dusty street, Thomas Mackenzie watched through the window of his general store, his jaw working like he was chewing nails. The new school teacher had arrived just 3 weeks ago from Boston, carrying herself with the kind of quiet dignity that made small men feel smaller. She'd started teaching not just letters and numbers, but ideas about treating the Mexican children the same as the white ones, about women having thoughts worth hearing. The townspeople had been whispering. Some said she was too uppity. Others said she asked too many questions about why certain families lived on the wrong side of the creek, why certain children weren't welcome in the schoolhouse. Thomas had seen her walking to the schoolhouse each morning, her hair catching the early light like spun copper. He'd tipped his hat. She'd nodded back with eyes the color of winter sky, direct, unafraid. Now those same eyes stared at nothing as she slowly gathered the severed locks, her white dress stained with dust and humiliation. The men were already moving on, slapping each other's backs, heading into the saloon for another round to celebrate their triumph over Eastern propriety. Sarah finally stood, her legs unsteady. She held the bundle of hair against her chest like it was something that could still be saved, still be made whole. Thomas stepped out of his store, his boots heavy on the wooden walkway. The late sun stretched his shadow long and dark across the street between them. "Miss Hartwell," Thomas's voice carried across the empty street, quiet but firm, "might be best if you came inside." Sarah turned toward him, and he saw something in her expression that made his chest tighten, not tears but something worse, a kind of hollow recognition, as if she'd always known this moment would come, had been waiting for it since the day she'd stepped off the eastbound stage. "I believe," she said, her voice steady as church bells, "that I've worn out my welcome in your fine town." The handful of remaining hair fell from her fingers, caught by the evening wind and scattered like autumn leaves. She brushed the dust from her skirts with mechanical precision, each movement controlled, deliberate. Thomas glanced toward the saloon where Morrison and his friends were already deep in their cups, their laughter carrying through the bat-wing doors like the sound of breaking glass. He knew these men, had sold them supplies, shared drinks, called some of them friends. They were his customers, his neighbors, his community, but they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "The stage doesn't come through again until Thursday," he said, stepping down into the street. "That's 4 days, I'm aware." Sarah's chin lifted slightly. "I can manage. Where will you stay?" "Morrison owns the boarding house. His brother-in-law runs the hotel." For the first time uncertainty flickered across her features. The schoolhouse had been her home, but that was owned by the town council, Morrison's friends, Morrison's drinking partners. Thomas made his choice in the space between heartbeats. "You'll stay with me. I've got a spare room above the store. It's not much, but it's clean and it's got a lock on the door." "Mr. Mackenzie, I couldn't possibly." "You could. You will." He moved closer, lowering his voice. "What they did to you, that wasn't justice. That wasn't Christian. That was just meanness dressed up as righteousness." Sarah studied his face, searching for the lie, the trap, the hidden price. She'd learned to read men quickly in her short time here, learned to spot the ones who smiled while they calculated what they could take from her. But Thomas Mackenzie's eyes held something different, something that reminded her of her father, who'd taught school in Vermont until the consumption took him, who'd believed that knowledge was the only thing nobody could steal from you. "Why?" she asked simply. Thomas looked back toward the saloon, then at the scattered hair dancing in the dust. "Because somebody has to choose what's right over what's easy." Behind them hoofbeats approached from the east, riders coming hard and fast, their dust cloud visible against the darkening sky. The riders emerged from the dust like harbingers, 6 men on lathered horses, their faces grim beneath wide-brimmed hats. At their head rode Marshal James Crawford, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight like a warning. Thomas felt Sarah tense beside him. Crawford was Morrison's cousin, cut from the same cloth but with legal authority to make his prejudices stick. Heard there was some trouble in town, Crawford called out, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man who'd already made up his mind about guilt and innocence. His horse stamped impatiently as he surveyed the scene, the scattered hair, Sarah's butchered head, Thomas standing protectively beside her. Morrison appeared in the saloon doorway, a beer mug in his fist and satisfaction written across his flushed face. "No trouble, Marshal, just gave the school ma'am a lesson in local customs." Crawford's gaze fixed on Thomas. "Mackenzie, didn't expect to see you mixed up in this." "Not mixed up in anything, Marshal, just offering Christian hospitality to someone who needs it." "That's so." Crawford dismounted slowly, deliberately. "Funny thing though, got word from the territorial capital yesterday. Seems they're mighty interested in certain irregularities in how this town's been handling federal education funds. Questions about why certain children aren't being taught, why certain families are being excluded." Sarah's breath caught. Thomas felt the shift in the air, the way the wind changes before a storm. "Now I wonder," Crawford continued, "who might have been asking those kinds of questions, who might have been writing letters to people who don't understand how things work out here." The other riders had spread out, casual-like, but Thomas recognized the formation. They'd done this before, surrounded someone, made sure there was no way out. "Marshal," Thomas said carefully, "Miss Hartwell's leaving on Thursday's stage." "No need for." "Oh, but there is need." Crawford's hand rested on his gun butt, thumb working the leather strap. "See, troublemakers have a way of spreading their poison even after they leave. Questions get asked. Investigations get started. Good men's reputations get ruined." Morrison stepped into the street, emboldened by his cousin's presence. "Maybe the lady needs a more permanent lesson about keeping her nose out of other people's business." Sarah stepped forward, and Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. "Marshal Crawford, if you have charges to bring against me, I demand to know what they are." Crawford smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made good people lock their doors. "Who said anything about charges, school ma'am? Sometimes justice works faster than law." The sun had nearly set, painting the street in shades of blood and shadow. Thomas counted 6 lawmen, Morrison, and at least 3 other men emerging from the saloon, against 1 shopkeeper, and a woman with no weapon but her stubborn courage. "Last chance, Mackenzie," Crawford said softly. "Walk away, go back to your stall, forget you ever saw this woman." Thomas looked at Sarah, at her ruined hair, her straight spine, her eyes that refused to show fear even when facing down a dozen armed men. He thought about his father, who died at Gettysburg fighting for the idea that all men were created equal. He thought about his mother, who'd raised him to believe that character was measured by what you did when nobody was watching, except somebody was always watching. "I reckon," Thomas said, his voice steady as bedrock, "that won't be happening." The standoff stretched like a held breath, tension crackling in the air between drawn guns and desperate courage. Then from the growing shadows behind Murphy's saloon, a small figure emerged. Maria Santos, barely 8 years old, clutching a slate tablet against her chest. Behind her came 3 more children, Pedro, Ana, little Miguel, all Mexican, all students. Sarah had been teaching in secret after the regular school hours ended. "Maestra," Maria whispered, using the Spanish word for teacher. Her dark eyes were wide with fear, but she stepped forward anyway, her small hand reaching for Sarah's. Crawford cursed under his breath. Morrison's face darkened. "What the hell are those kids doing here?" "Learning," Sarah said simply, her voice breaking for the first time since the scissors had fallen. She knelt and gathered Maria into her arms, the child's thin body trembling against her. "They're learning." Thomas watched Crawford's face, saw the calculation there. Killing a teacher was one thing, could be explained away, justified as maintaining order. Killing children was another matter entirely, the kind that brought federal investigators, and territorial governors and consequences that reached all the way to Washington. Maria, Thomas said gently, take the others home, tell your families everything's going to be all right. But Maria shook her head, her small chin set with the same stubborn courage that had gotten Sarah into this mess. No, Signor Mackenzie, the maestra taught us about standing up, about doing what's right even when it's scary. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something that made Sarah's breath catch, a small wooden cross, carved with careful hands and rubbed smooth with wear. It had belonged to Sarah's grandmother, the only thing of value she'd brought west. You dropped this, Maria said, pressing it into Sarah's palm. When the bad men, when they hurt you. I picked it up. Sarah's fingers closed around the cross, feeling the familiar grooves worn by 3 generations of women who'd faced their own darkness and chose hope anyway. Her grandmother had carried it through the Irish potato famine. Her mother had clutched it during the terrible winter when diphtheria took 2 of Sarah's siblings. Now it was worn from a child's pocket, given back by small hands that understood the weight of sacrifice. Thank you, Sarah whispered, and for the first time since the scissors fell, tears came, not from pain or fear, but from something deeper, something that reminded her why she'd come west in the first place. Thomas saw Crawford's resolve wavering, the man's political instincts warring with his cousin's bloodlust. The children changed everything, made this about more than just silencing one uppity teacher. Marshall, Thomas said quietly, whole lot of witnesses here now, might be worth thinking about how this story gets told. Crawford's hand moved away from his gun, just slightly. In that small gesture, Thomas saw the first crack in their certainty, the first doubt in their righteous anger. But Morrison wasn't ready to back down, and his whiskey-fueled rage had only grown hotter. Enough, Morrison roared, pulling his gun. I'm done listening to lectures from some Eastern whore and her. The shot cracked through the evening air, but it wasn't Morrison's gun that fired. Thomas's Colt Python had appeared in his hand with the fluid motion of a man who'd learned to shoot before he'd learned to read, and Morrison's weapon went spinning into the dust, along with 2 of the man's fingers. Morrison screamed, clutching his ruined hand to his chest. The other men froze, suddenly remembering that quiet Thomas Mackenzie had worn Confederate gray for 4 years, had been one of Mosby's Rangers before he'd come home to Arizona to forget the war. Next man who draws on children gets more than his fingers shot off, Thomas said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who'd killed before and would do it again if necessary. Crawford raised his hands slowly. Now Mackenzie, let's. Thomas kept his gun trained on the marshal. Let's talk about what happens next. Miss Hartwell is leaving on Thursday's stage, just like she planned. Until then she's under my protection. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me. This isn't over, Crawford said, but the fight had gone out of him. Political calculations were working behind his eyes, and they all came up the same way. Too many witnesses, too many ways this could go wrong for him. Yes, Sarah said, standing up with Maria still clinging to her skirt. It is. She looked around at the men who'd terrorized her, at the children who'd risked everything to stand beside her, at Thomas Mackenzie, who'd chosen courage over comfort. I came here to teach, and I have taught, not just letters and numbers, but something more important. That cruelty isn't strength. That power without compassion is just another word for cowardice. She touched her ruined hair, then smiled, the first real smile Thomas had seen from her. Hair grows back, character doesn't, and I'd rather be bald than be any of you. Morrison was led away by the doctor, whimpering about his hand. Crawford and his men mounted up, their authority deflated by the presence of children and the town's sudden realization that maybe they'd gone too far. As the dust settled, Maria tugged on Sarah's skirt. Maestra, will you write to us? Will you remember us? Every day, Sarah promised, kneeling again to meet the child's eyes. And someday, when you're old enough, you come find me. There's a whole world out there that needs teachers like you. Thursday came gray and cold, with winter promising in the wind. Thomas loaded Sarah's trunk onto the stage, noting how light it was. Just books, mostly, and a few clothes. Everything that really mattered could fit in a traveling bag. Where will you go? He asked. California first. Maybe Oregon after that. There's always somewhere that needs a school. The stage driver called for boarding. Sarah climbed up, then turned back. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you," Thomas replied, and meant it, for reminding me who I wanted to be. Years later, when Thomas was an old man with silver hair and stories to tell, he would remember that Thursday morning, and the woman who'd taught him that sometimes courage looked like standing up to bullies, and sometimes it looked like getting back on a stage with your head held high and your faith intact. He never saw Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell again, but he heard stories. A school in Sacramento where Mexican and Chinese children learned alongside white ones, a letter to the territorial governor that started an investigation into education funding, a woman with short hair who'd helped write California's first integrated education law, and sometimes, on quiet Thursday mornings when the stage came through, he'd remember the lesson she'd taught them all, that you could cut someone's hair, but you couldn't cut their spirit. That cruelty might win battles, but dignity won wars. That was the last frame Thomas held in his memory, Sarah's face in the stage window, scarred but not broken, heading west toward a future she'd build with her own two hands, and an unshakable belief that tomorrow could be better than today. The dust cloud faded into the distance, but the lesson remained.